afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves closer to consultation round 3 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities or are of community importance. So we hope that these will help our viewers and listeners get a better understanding of the project and provide input, of course, along the way. With me today and in many other shows going forward is Jennifer Ashwazage Pereira, my colleague and an Indigenous engagement and traditional knowledge specialist at Atkins Realis, and Jennifer is a member of Henvey Inlet First Nation, located on the French River, just south of Sudbury. And so she works with me on projects all across Canada. So welcome, Jen, to the
Thank you
team.
much.
And we got lots to talk about today and in future shows here. So let's get rolling here. I hope our listeners enjoy this and viewers enjoy this topic today. It's an interesting one, and the topic isn't an issue right now in the current Webequay Supply Road, given where the current Webequay Supply Road project is, but it definitely will be as all of the all-season road projects in the area begin to be built. And the topic is road access and control issues. And it's centered around the issues community members have raised in the past about what might happen when their remote communities become connected to the provincial road network. So we think this is an important topic to discuss, even though it's like I said, it's early in the process, but it's good to talk about these issues and share that discussion with our viewers and listeners and get their feedback as well too. So just to remind everyone, you can contact us toll free. Call or text us toll free at 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. So why don't we get started here, Jen? And I will begin with a little rundown of today's topics. If we can bring the PowerPoint up on the screen. We're going to kick things off with our usual refresher course in the Webequay Supply Road project, just to make sure everybody's at the same sort of level of knowledge in terms of what the project is about, what its aspirations are. After that, we're going to talk about previous studies on all-season roads in the area, because these studies were pretty comprehensive and revealed a lot of interesting information about what community members thought or thinking or like in terms of good things and bad things about an all-season road connection to the provincial highway network. So we're going to discuss these good and bad things from that report, and then we're going to talk about some of the concerns about increased access that were raised by community members and that we've heard occasionally in our engagement and consultation sessions with communities. We're going to talk a bit about possible mitigation methods for road access and control, and then we're going to wrap things up by telling you how you can get in touch with us. So let's move now to the project location, just to give people a bit of an idea of as to what. Oh, never know when your phone's going to ring. So today's topics, we're going to start with project location, and the project location is in northwestern Ontario. Uh, Webequay Supply Road runs from the airport in Webequay southeast to the McFalds Lake area really in the heart of the Ring of Fire. And so that's where the location of the project is about 200 to 250 kilometers from both Hudson Bay and James Bay. And in terms of the purpose of the Webequie Supply Road, uh, moving materials, supplies, and people from the airport in Webequie to the McFalds Lake area to help provide support to the development activities or the operational activities there. Providing, if we can change the slide, please, to the next slide. Providing employment and economic development opportunities to Webequie while allowing them to preserve and enhance their language and culture as well, and continue to live in the community as well. And then finally, providing experience and training opportunities for youth to encourage the pursuit of additional skills and post-secondary education as well for better jobs and more high-paying jobs. In terms of the project itself, if we can move to the project description slide, the project itself is 107 kilometers. It's planned to be 107 kilometers long, running again from Webequie Airport to McFalds Lake area. 17 of those 107 kilometers sit within Webequie First Nation reserve lands. The preliminary corridor, so there's now a preferred corridor, so sort of a band of land within which the actual road would sit, is 2 kilometers wide. So this corridor has been identified through consultations with community members, much of which happened, these consultations within the community happened quite a while ago as well. So they put a lot of thought into um, where this preliminary road corridor should go, and then the actual final corridor width, the cleared area, would be 35 meters. And moving along in terms of the project description, there will be 3 major water body crossings, that of Winisk Lake, Winiscus's Channel, and then at the far east end of the road, Bukatai River. And as I always say, it's more than just a road. This project, it involves other temporary and permanent um, facilities as well. So there's temporary and permanent aggregate and pit or rock quarry areas. Um, and then there's access roads to get to these locations, as well as crossing structures if required, such as culverts or bridges to cross any water courses along the access road as well to get to those materials that are needed for construction. And then we have the construction camps, which are temporary, and these, of course, accommodate the construction crews and there would be a permanent operations and maintenance office uh, or offices at one or multiple locations as well along the road, and then associated with the camps as well are temporarily at least wastewater plants, treatment plants, small ones, and portable water storage as well. So, and then in the process of construction, you need areas to store equipment and materials, lay down all this material as well. And so those would be included in terms of the what you call the ancillary or additional infrastructure that are that are required as part of the road. So now let's move on and talk a little bit about the background on road access and control issues and what I'm going to do is talk a little bit, introduce you to a study that was done in 2015 and 2016 that I was involved in. It was done by 3 different companies. And this was a fairly in-depth, large study involving 4 communities in the area, including Yamatong, Niskandiga, Webequie, and Nibenomic First Nations. And the idea behind it was to identify a best route that would connect the communities to the provincial highway network. This best route was based on factors such as community preferences, um, indigenous knowledge was a big part of it, as well as the typical information such as terrain, like the type of land that the road might be going through, whether it's muskeg or sort of esker areas, the slope and the characteristics of that land, like the slope of the land as well. So um, again, this was a very sort of deep dive in terms of engagement. There was extensive engagement that was done with all four communities. A lot of effort and time was spent on this. There were 4 rounds of engagement. Um, we got, excuse me, a lot of detailed feedback received from community members about being potentially connected to the highway network, and so much information we got back that we want to share that with you today. So just the next slide just shows a couple of the maps. There were a total of 10 different options that were developed um, that would connect these 4 communities to a main road, which would then connect ultimately to the provincial highway network. And then there were different options in terms of where it would connect to the provincial highway network. So there was a lot of effort put into this study. But what was most interesting, I think, was the identification of what community members felt about the idea of going from a remote community to a community that would now be connected to the provincial highway network, because there were a lot of positive things that community members identified about this connection, but there are also some negative things too. So that's why I thought it was worth talking about in this presentation. So let's move to the next slide, and I'll just and Jen, feel free to jump in and add to this. But
I
these
have
are
a
remote
question though,
communities.
Don,
Sure, Jen. Yeah, go ahead.
before you continue. So you were talking about those studies that took place in 2015-16, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Or 14, 2015-16?
Yep.
And so some of those routes were kind of pre-selected, and you talked about community preferences, but what kind of preferences went into those potential selections?
So yeah, that's a great question. I can tell you what was really interesting about that was that one of the big things, and that's why your question is really good. One of the big things that came out was that community members, these 4 communities, there's a lot of relatives um,
Hmm.
that exist. They many
Kinship
of them
ties,
stemmed,
yeah.
I think. Yeah, yeah, and so there's a lot of very close ties between members of these different communities, and because they live in remote communities, and as you know, it's very expensive to travel. They rarely had opportunities to see their relatives. So one of the things that was always brought up was, we want to be able to see our relatives. And for example, like Webequie community members would say, we want to see our relatives in Nibenomic. And so, that was a really big factor, in terms of the routing. Like, well, we definitely want to be connected to these other communities. We don't want to just sort of, yeah, well, we want to connect to the all season road, but it's very important for us to be able to see our relatives. So that was a big factor in terms of the preferences. But again,
Okay.
there's some of the, there's the economic side of things, Jen, right? There's when you look at how much it costs to ship things by air, right? And you
It's
know how
crazy.
expensive things are. It's crazy
And then
expensive.
do we actually even know what the winter road is looking like this year?
Yeah, it depends on which winter road you're talking about. The Webequie one,
Hmm.
it's open, but again, the seasons are getting shorter and shorter, right? And they're opening later, and the ice isn't as thick as it maybe has been historically, right? So the loads have to be lighter, so you're not getting as
So
much
there's,
material into the
yeah.
community. So it's a real
Safety
problem, right?
issues and higher costs, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, part of this study we looked at, how much would prices come down, as much as you could predict that, right? And there's obviously really significant cost savings when you have a direct link by road with these
Mm-hmm.
communities, right? So, the economic side was huge. It was a big difference maker. Um, but the other thing, and feel free to jump in too, is there's just more educational opportunities, and education was more community members saw the ability. For example, like in many of these remote communities, they don't have the high schools, right? Now
Mm-hmm.
maybe they're starting to get virtual high schools. Sometimes some communities are getting high schools, or at least a couple of grades of high school, but quite often, high school students have to go and for example, go to Thunder Bay and live in Thunder Bay. And they're not able to because of the crazy cost of airfare. They're not able to see their family, for long
Yeah,
periods of time.
and
But with a
then
fixed
maybe
link,
with the
right?
road, yeah, and
Yes.
better internet, right?
Yeah,
That
exactly.
that
And
opens a lot
and
of doors.
it does, and perhaps it might, start to reduce, some of the mental health issues that and the challenges that young people face when they have to move to an urban center that they've never lived in before, right? Having
Mm-hmm.
moved from the community to a place like Thunder Bay, for example, it's a big change in lifestyle. And so the
Well,
fact
that's
that they
it.
they can they could connect with their parents more frequently may just mitigate that, make it a little bit easier on them because they still get to see their their family more often, right? So,
Right. And
uh,
increased access to healthcare, dentist, optometrist,
absolutely.
because quite often, when we were in community, I heard that people have to wait till they're in dire straits or such emergencies
Yep.
to be able to have this kind of care. So I think that's uh,
Totally, Jen.
convenient to
You
be
know,
able to be better connected to that.
you're switching to more of a preventative type medicine, right? Or preventative dentistry, depending on what you're talking about, because you're
Hmm.
able to go regularly, right? Because there's not this huge obstacle where you have to have like an absolute acute case in order to be able to justify getting flown to Thunder Bay to get your, some dental work done. You know what I mean? Or a medical procedure. So,
Yeah, and it
that was
doesn't
a
have to
big.
be emergency management. Hmm.
Exactly, right? And in the end, probably it's much cheaper for the province because it's, if you're treating people on a regular basis, it's preventive medicine, preventive dentistry, probably costs less, for the province in the long run anyway. Um, so, there was all kinds of benefits that were pointed out. And of course, the social benefit, right? Like more support for issues of, addiction and mental health, obviously, um, more higher income from increased activity, more job opportunities,
Hmm.
potentially. Um, and again, like the last one on this slide, better connection to neighboring communities and relations, seeing your friends and relatives more often, right? So on a from a mental health perspective, that's nothing but positive. And then
Yeah,
if
that's
we move
pretty
to the
huge.
next, yeah, it's huge, right? So these are almost intangibles. You can't put a dollar figure on these, really. And then if we look at some of the other ones on the next slide, like the idea of
I
having a
like one of my
corridor.
favorite. Sorry, I'm interrupting you,
No,
but
go ahead, Jen.
one of my favorite things is that parents will be able to see their kids in high school more often. That is
Oh,
so important.
huge. Absolutely, right? Because it's so intimidating. Moving, it's like you're going to another planet, right? Going from your
Well, I know,
community
and
to
I,
a
I
big
couldn't
center.
I couldn't imagine sending a high schooler off to go to high
Yeah.
school in the city. I had a hard enough time when my son went to college and he wasn't that far away.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a great point, Jen. Like it's so there's a lot of there's a lot of good things, right, that were pointed out
Mm-hmm.
as part of this. And again, this is the result of this is sort of a one table summary of like 2 years of pretty intense engagement. But now let's move on now and talk a little bit about some of the bad things or some of the concerns that community members had, and they kind of organized these things. If we can move to not the next slide, but the slide after that. Uh, so these were organized into next slide after that.
Into
Next one.
4 separate categories.
Yes,
But
this
we
one. Yeah,
didn't
that's right.
go over
So
some of the environmental pluses on the other one, Don,
yeah, we can go. We can
when
go
we were
back to.
talking
I
about
guess
like,
I was.
yeah,
Yeah. So the environmental pluses. Yeah. I mean, there's
less reliance
obviously.
on diesel.
Yeah, that's right. If you get the transmission lines in place, and that's
Mm-hmm.
significant, right? That's a big one. You're right. And then like the fiber optic cable, well, that's already going into. I think all these communities now are going to be connected as part
Yay.
of the current program, or but at least having that corridor in place allows, means a cleared area where it could be installed, or if you wanted to do more or expand the system or whatever. But converting from diesel to transmission is huge, right? That's a huge one because it allows the community it's to more easily grow um, because there's more capacity available,
Yeah, and
power
then I
capacity
think there
available
will
to them.
be better health outcomes as well. I remember when I was working
Oh,
a lot around diesel generators, I quite often
yeah,
had laryngitis.
yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, just the exhaust in the area, right? Those are running 24/7. Yeah, I can imagine that. So yeah, there's some really good environmental benefits, obviously, like once transmission were to get into communities for sure. So if we can go to 2 slides ahead. So the one that has these were divided into 4 separate categories: natural
At slide
environment, social
13.
health, economic, and culture. There we are. Oh, no, we're a little ahead of ourselves here. We got to go back to all 4 categories. So go back one more, I think. Okay, there we are. Okay, so 4 separate categories. So when these were concerns that community members had, so we grouped them into 4 different categories: natural environment being one, social and health being another, economic, and then culture. And if we can move to the next slide, talk a little bit about natural environment. Obviously, with an all-season road in place, there's the potential for impacts on animal habitat and animal movement, um, impacts on possible loss of habitat, and then impacts on water resources from things like erosion or fuel spills. Now, all of these things, as you know, as part of an environmental assessment, are identified, and then methods to mitigate or reduce or minimize the impact of, or in some cases eliminate, are
Mm-hmm.
identified as part of the environmental assessment. So that's the natural environment side of things. But let's move to the social and health, which is probably one of the bigger ones. So, this is a concern that you and I, Jen, have heard about, right? There's the
Yes.
concern that with an all-season road link, that ultimately connects to the provincial highway network, which of course would not be the case for the Webway Supply Road alone, only when all the other roads are put in place as well and built. Then you would then have the Webway Supply Road ultimately connected to the provincial highway
Northern
network. But
Road Link. Yeah.
that's right, and the Martin Falls Community Access Road. So, again, you and I have heard people are concerned about easier access to substances, causing more health and social issues in the community, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they're saying, well, now it's easier, right? There's fewer
That's
barriers to
right.
getting these substances in. So this is one we hear, right? You and I hear pretty pretty frequently, and it's a totally understandable one. Um, Another one is the concern that I guess the way I like to describe it is like a population leakage, like people moving to urban areas now that they're able
Right.
to, and so they may just
The
stay in
out
these urban areas
migration.
and
Or
yeah,
on the
out
other hand, we
migration.
might see people moving home because that opportunity is there, right?
It exactly. That's right. It goes both ways, right? And
Hmm.
or you may see community members living sort of two lives, right? Like there's an urban life where they work and then they go back to their community for, for periods of time, right? For traditional activities and may live part-time, right, in their community as well too, right? There's that side of it. Another big one that I know you and I hear is the concern about outsiders coming in, right?
Yep.
Like whether it's
These
hunters, right?
Southerners.
The Southerners, that's
That's
right.
right. The
So hunters,
Southerners.
the Southerners coming
That's
in and
that's not
harvesting,
me.
right? No, no, you're a Centraler.
Yeah,
You're a
Tony.
Centraler.
Tony was teasing me earlier about being a Southerner, but yeah, people are concerned about strangers coming into the territory, and with that,
Yes.
comes some potential safety issues because people are seriously concerned about women and children and two-spirited people, right, for their health and safety
Yep.
as well. And there was the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, and they had, I think it was 231 recommendations. And so there were a couple of those recommendations aimed at the resource industry. And so I think, looking at issues like that, we can certainly pull some of those recommendations when we're talking about mitigating some of these more negative factors that people are talking about.
Yeah, and as this project moves along and matures, right, Jen? Like we'll get closer to a situation where we need to develop systems, right, for ensuring that women and girls are protected, right? Things like that, right? And building that in, so as you move closer to actual reality, I like to call it like the actual construction of the road and
Yeah, yeah.
operation of the road. These are the things you got to think about, as well as some of the stuff we're
Uh,
going to talk about coming up
and
very
prevention
shortly.
of poaching.
Yeah, and well, that's a real issue too, right? And
Yeah,
also encroachment and tourist setting up tourist resort areas because all of a sudden now this road is running into the homeland of these First Nations, and then people from the south might try to take advantage of economic opportunities, and while and leaving maybe the First Nations without those opportunities themselves. So these are all things that have to be considered and protected against, right? As you move closer
absolutely.
to the construction. So and then we move on to the economic side of things. There's one issue that I remember came up when we were doing this study was the possible loss of government transfer payments due to the loss of remote isolation status. But I mean, that's the one conclusion we came to with that was that,
Hmm.
that's the kind of thing where over time it has to get phased in over time. Because you don't just because a road's connected to your community and your community is no longer remote doesn't mean all your economic challenges go away immediately, right? It has to be.
Well,
There's
no, and
more to
there
it than that.
absolutely, and there needs to be time to build capacity in community
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
because
Right.
people have to get mobile because if you're living way up north, there's some things that you need to be able to drive to the south, if you will. A vehicle,
It's a
for instance.
multi-pronged effort, right? You can't just build the
It
road and
is,
magically everything goes
and
away, like
expect
all
it. Yeah.
problems go away. It can't work that way, right? So let's move on now to the next slide, which is the culture slide. So this is an interesting one, and you can look at it from a bunch of different perspectives. But um, one perspective is like the easier access to the outside, so to speak, or to the provincial highway network um, could put pressure on the language, maybe, and on the traditions and the culture. There might be an
Hmm.
erosion. Um, Sometimes it works the other way, doesn't it, Jen? I guess it can, right? Because if a community
I
maybe is
think
doing
so.
better economically, maybe they can protect their language and culture better, right? I guess.
And that's it. That
Uh,
you know what that reminds me of something that a Soyuz Indian band chief Clarence Louis said at the beginning. Close to the beginning when their community he brought them out of poverty. Let's say that.
yeah.
And so when they started developing all of their economic opportunities, they came up against some negativity for prospering off. And that community, I know it's a lot different than this one, but I just want to use as an example of what he was saying. So one of the things was they had a vineyard, and so that was met with some criticisms. And he said, "Listen, look, you're going to lose your culture and language faster in poverty than you would in wealth." And so that's always a quote that I remember. And especially when in my community, we developed a wind farm. And that was one of the things that I remembered. And some of the things that we talked about is that when you have that wealth created from economic opportunities, that really helps to preserve and reclaim some of those cultural aspects of our communities.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, that's a good, really good point. Um, another point here was possibility for outsiders, so people from the south, to access and affect sacred areas, lands, and places. Right? If they're not protected properly, this is a
Yeah, that's
possibility.
hard.
It's hard. Yeah, it is a hard one, isn't it?
Hmm.
Yeah, there's no easy solution, to this, but and then again, the one we talked about before is easier access from the south. Um, it might impact traditional activities, right? Um,
Hmm.
Especially if there's people coming from the south and harvesting who didn't really harvest there before because it was remote and it was really only a fly-in opportunity, right, for people from the
Hmm.
south. That could definitely
Yeah,
have an
because
impact.
then
And
an impact on people's sustainability because many
yes,
people
ability to sustain
harvest
themselves.
food. Yeah, and so they
Yeah,
eat, they get their
absolutely.
medicines, and their good health. Their
We can move to the
immunoglobulin comes from the area.
Let's move to the next slide if we can. We're going to talk a bit about the possible mitigation methods for road access and control. So again, this is, we're just sort of looking into our crystal ball here, but looking at some of the tools that might be available or ideas that could be discussed, right? And if we move to, oh, we got it here. So we got it up on the screen. When I use, again, the term mitigation, we like to use that a lot when it comes to environmental assessments. What it means, again, is controlling or reducing or even sometimes eliminating impacts. So, with when it comes to things, to projects like the Webequay Supply Road, these discussions haven't occurred about road ownership or regulation or policing or operations and maintenance. They haven't happened yet. They will as the project gets closer to construction. Um, and again, the Webequay Supply Road on its own doesn't connect to the provincial highway network. It depends on the construction of both the Northern Road Link and the Martin Falls community access roads. And if we move to the next slide, Jen, some of the considerations that you don't always think about right away, but they're operational, right? And so, what rules and regulations would vehicles operate under on the all-season road? Like, who would be the who would be the police? Is it the OPP? Is it NAPS? Is it subject to the Highway Traffic Act? These are all things that have to be considered, right? So if it's subject to the
Hmm.
Highway Traffic Act, there would be then insurance requirements, which don't currently apply on reserve, right? So you have unlicensed vehicles on reserve that are only driving on the reserve and not driving off the reserve on on roads that are subject to the Highway Traffic Act. So, there's lots of these kind of considerations that you don't maybe think about off the top of your head, but they're
Speed
important, right?
limits.
Speed limits too. Yeah, there's another one,
Yeah,
right?
because 107 kilometers sounds like for us, where we live, about an hour, just a slightly over an hour's
Yeah,
drive. But if it's an 80K
gravel
speed
road.
limit, that's going to be, yeah, in a gravel road. What are you looking at? Almost
Yeah.
2 hours for one trip,
Yep.
one way.
Exactly. And then, some of the, I remember some of the ideas that were tossed around when we were doing this study were things like using security gates, right? Or checkpoints to do inspections for drugs and alcohol. Just like they're
I, I've
like
seen
occur at the airports.
I've seen
You've seen
something
these, have you?
similar to that. But not they didn't look for drugs and alcohol, but when going on the Billy Diamond Highway into EU territory. So there's a checkpoint there because that road is well over 600 kilometers, and then it branches off to James Bay communities and then inland communities, kind of all the way up to Radisson, and the most northern Cree community there is Chisasibe. And so you have to stop. They take a picture of your license plate. You tell them your name and how many people are in your car. Give their names as well. And then when you're expected to come back, kind of where you're going, because there are some safety issues on that highway as well because of how long it
Oh,
is, and it's not police patrolled, and there's no cell service. And then they also ask you if you've
oh,
topped up your gas tank, because the next gas station is not for 381 kilometers. So that one's, you can understand some of that
yeah,
stuff to ensure people's safety, and if they don't get back when they're supposed to, then they have to call search and rescue, and the helicopters come out,
yeah.
because that area is also known for kayaking and hiking.
Oh, interesting. So it's purely a
Hmm.
safety checkpoint, I guess, more than anything else,
Yes.
as
Yes.
opposed to actually checking loads to see if contraband's being brought in or whatever, right?
That's right.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. And then the other idea that's been tossed around is special access permits, like some sort of permitting system where if people from the south, for example, wanted to enter the area, they would have to apply for a permit and explain, what their intentions are when they're going to use these areas and pay a fee, and that fee could serve as a source of revenue for the communities that they would be, whose territory they would, or homeland they'd be traveling through. So anyway, that's
Hmm.
another, that's just another one of the tools that's been discussed. Um, that has been discussed. I mean, again, this stuff all
Well,
has
that's
to be
super interesting.
sorted out going forward, right? As this gets closer to being
Hmm.
built. But there's a lot of stuff to consider. There's a lot of concerns that community members have. It's not that they can't necessarily be mitigated, right? But there's still concerns.
That's right. And we
So
need everybody's feedback to help think about what those possible mitigations could look like, right?
yeah, and that's kind of why we're bringing this up now, right? Is to try to,
Hmm.
present that to community members so they see that, that it's being thought about, and then try and solicit more input from them, in terms of concerns, and maybe they have ideas as to how these things can, how we can control some of these potential issues, right?
That's right.
So that leads us to the end of today's live stream. If we can move to the next slide, we want to hear from you. We actually do, and you can contact us. Please, check out our website, supplyroad.ca. I can tell you right now that this live stream will be posted on our website. They all are posted after they're recorded, and we look for your feedback on these. We're trying to identify topics that we think are interesting to community members, and get them to engage with us on the project. So, Jen, thanks a lot for joining me today. It was a good conversation. We're gonna keep
Oh,
these things
Teamy
going,
Glitch.
and
Right.
yeah, no,
And
I'm
don't
glad.
forget,
I'm glad.
people can let us know what topics they're interested in learning about, because
Yep,
we'd sure like to bring you more information on those, whatever it is you want to know more about.
you bet, Jen. You bet. So That wraps up today's discussion of road access and control issues, and we hope it was helpful and encourages you to join us again next week at the same time when we're going to talk about minimizing project impacts. There's that word mitigation again, Jen. I
Ooh,
love to use that
mitigation.
word mitigation. Yes. Word of the day. Word of the day. So don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, supplyroad.ca. Miigwech, and we will talk to you again next week.